Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, Republican of Oklahoma, likes to boast that he has been to Africa more than any other congressman. I think he might be correct. He likes to say that he has adopted, the family documents I had, he had adopted 11 African nations as his children, and that he has now added a 12th, I'm told. He has a budget for these nations. It's not a huge budget because most of his travel is paid for by those of us here who are U.S. citizens. We pay for his travel. He travels on our dime using military transport. He brings whole sort of groups of congressmen to Uganda. He meets with his brothers and the family. And one person to whom he has been a great inspiration is MP Bahati. Now, Bahati, of course, will claim that, and say, I think, that the anti-homosexuality bill was his idea. Well, it was a lot of people's idea. And I don't want to suggest that he's a puppet of the Americans. Rather, I want to suggest that the sort of the sex tourism of American fundamentalism, this idea of going to Africa and speaking about sex and preaching ideas about sex that you don't find getting as much traction in the United States as you want, that's a real sort of cultural exchange, for lack of a better term. Senator Inhofe, Senator Coburn, lives at the C Street House. Senator Coburn, I think, is famous for describing homosexuality as one of the top, maybe the top threats to American freedom. Inhofe, of course, is probably, most of you know, is famous. Maybe his greatest stunt was bringing a picture of his family, his many, many grandchildren, his sort of large extended family, blown up picture on the floor of the Senate to explain, this was important governmental business, that not one of them was homosexual. No queers in his family. He wanted us to know that. He also boasts, of course, that he will not hire a gay person. I'm told he might not be as fully aware on this issue as he thinks he is. This has been a crusade of his for a long time. In fact, if you're familiar with the sort of the catchphrase "God, gays, and guns," so we owe it to Jim Inhofe and his first Senate run, campaigning around Oklahoma on God, gays, and guns. So Senator Inhofe is over there, and he is an inspiration to Bahati. And I think the relationship here is these American politicians, part of the sex tourism is to talk about what they see as the fallen state of America. So it's a kind of a little bit the inverse of what we think of when we think of sex tourism. We think of these sort of these skeezy men who slink off to Thailand to hire underage prostitutes and that sort of thing. These men slink off to Uganda to talk about how there's too much wicked sex in America and that they love Uganda for its purity. And it's a purity that they are assured of by top politicians. I remember Minister of Ethics, Buturo, before he was out of office, when I interviewed him, to give me a sense of the scope of the problem, he says, Jeff, I have evidence that there may be as many as 100 homosexuals in Uganda. So in some ways, that's the good news, is wild incompetence is always inspiring on the right. But the sex tourism comes, and I think you can make a fairly strong case. Obviously, homophobia or anti-gay sentiment has been a part of Uganda for a long time, as it has been of most countries in the world. I think when we start to look at the relationship not just of the family, but of all these many churches, of the American sermons that are preached in Ugandan churches, of the American praise songs that are preached in Ugandan churches, the number of Ugandan churches that on Sunday morning where the preachers are preaching the same exact word-for-word text that's being preached, and I don't know, in Peoria, or perhaps in Orange County at Rick Warren's church. Rick Warren, who likes to say that he is not on a culture war with homosexuality, but then he goes to Africa and he says, there are things I can say here that I can't say there. That's sex tourism. That's sex tourism. That's like the men who go to Thailand and say, there are things I can do here. I can hire underage prostitutes that I can't do there. Rick Warren can go to Uganda and say, or Rwanda, and say, there are things I can tell you about homosexuality and bestiality and pedophilia that I can't say there. This sense of liberation, that the fight is joined in these countries, that the fight is lost here in the United States, but there is still hope for Africa. The Family, which I mentioned, is one of these organizations that did that. And I think, in closing, I want to sort of say one of the most interesting things about that is sex has never been part of their agenda. Going back to 1935, sex has never been part of their agenda. They are interesting and I think fairly unique in the history of American Christian conservatism, evangelism, and fundamentalism in the sense that their emphasis was originally economics, began as an anti-New Deal coalition, began, frankly, because they were terrified of movements like Occupy Wall Street. It began in response to the great 1934 general strike on the West Coast, and developed into foreign policy. And in fact, saw themselves as a steady hand pulling back American Christians from this kind of obsession with sex, saw themselves as more maybe even progressive in this regard. Certainly, you see that on display with two of their more prominent members, Senator John Ensign, who was once a high-ranking Republican until he got caught in the C Street scandal with his chief of staff's wife, Governor Mark Sanford, who, boy, if he was in the presidential race right now, as he was expected to be, I really do think he would be cleaning up. And then he, went to Argentina instead. And Representative Chip Pickering, not as well known from Mississippi, actually had his affair in the C Street house, registered as a church, and actually extremely influential politician, one of the guys who led the way for the deregulation of media, which puts us in this media position where we don't really have a functioning press to counter some of these lies. So the Family never cared about sex, and yet sex bubbles up. And I think that's part of the idea that I want to stress with the sex tourism of American fundamentalism, and maybe even with the missionary position, so to speak. You find so many people going over with good intentions, interested in building hospitals, interested in building schools, deep paternalism, yes, but not authoritarianism. And yet the obsession with the sexual culture wars here in the United States preoccupies. It's a fight, it's a conflict, and those of us in the press know a conflict is always an easier story to tell than the long, slow process of community building. And so they export that conflict to those countries. They go there meaning to build schools and hospitals, and they do some of that, but the real gift so many of these missionaries bring is the gift of American-style culture war. And there's something tragic about this. There's something tragic about this in the Family. It's why, again and again, they're sort of puzzled by why I've spoken about this and Rachel Maddow has spoken about this again and again. But we mean well. We didn't mean for them to do this. That's not what we meant to happen. This will sound unduly harsh, but it reminds me, again, when you study traditional sex tourism, of the rhetoric of those men who go off to Thailand and they don't seek out underage prostitutes, they just seek out regular prostitutes. And they say, I just wanted a free time, a liberated time. I didn't mean to contribute to this whole world of international sex trafficking. That wasn't what I was meaning to do. There's a lack of accountability. The idea when you can buy and sell human beings, that's going to expand and it's going to go overseas. And that traditional sex tourism, and I think in the missionary position of which I speak in the title of my talk, is that when you can tell other people how to believe and what to believe, when you feel as if your economic privilege has given you a more direct line to God, and of course, no American Christian would ever say that, but it's an old tradition in the American church. There are many who believe it and feel it. Certainly Senator Inhofe is one of them. Then those ideas are going to spread. The Family is fond of the word contagion. They like to think of their ideas as contagion. And they're correct. Contagion tends to follow sex tourism. One last point I want to make. Because here, this is sort of, as I understand, a strategy meeting. There's, I think, the debate, especially in Uganda, and I'm interested in learning here, what is the most effective approach? Is it the sort of the quiet diplomacy? Or is it the sort of the international media outcry? I'm wary of saying one or the other. I think as soon as we say one or the other, and there are those who say, no, this is the way to go, then you give up what is frankly a weapon in your arsenal and the fight for human rights, whether it's one or the other. But I urge caution, especially on quiet diplomacy. I think it's absolutely necessary, and part of it, reaching out to people, talking to some of these political leaders, but it can be so dangerous. And I think of the phrase common ground. And I think of the last day I was in Uganda at David Bahati's house, having lunch with him. And he kept emphasizing, Jeff, what I have learned in the family is that you are not my enemy, you are my brother. Let us love one another and let us find common ground. And I suspect that this is very appealing rhetoric to many of us here. Let us find common ground. Now is not the time to find common ground with David Bahati. I'm troubled by those religious groups that says, maybe if we can just sit down and talk with him. This is another kind of missionary paternalism. To assume that he doesn't know what he's doing. To assume that the leaders of this movement, that Martin Sempa, just never heard it expressed right. No, see, Martin, let me show you the Bible. You don't know how to read it. And Martin's going to say, I didn't realize. Well, I'm sorry, I changed my mind. No, now is not the time for common ground with those folks. I always think, common ground's kind of a bad metaphor because it's a geographic metaphor. It's literally a spatial metaphor. Common ground doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything good, doesn't mean anything bad. It's neutral. A plantation is a common ground. Master and slave stand on common ground. We need something deeper and more complex and richer, and I'm hoping I'll learn about what it might be here. Thanks very much.